One of the most frequently asked questions for people in the first year, 2 years of woodworking is crosscut sled or miter gauge. Now, it should be pretty obvious that when I got my miter gauge, I did not get rid of my crosscut sled. In fact, I have another one just meant for cutting a specific angle as well. This is not an easy question to answer, but if you're looking for only an answer, here's what I will say. Do you have a project that requires cutting odd or specific angles and not just one of them? Do you own a miter saw that is relatively accurate? If you own a miter saw that's relatively accurate, you can go ahead, save money, and build a crosscut sled. If you don't, and you have a project that requires odd or specific or multiple angles, the miter gauge is going to be what's right for you. Neither of these can replace the other in many of their kind of features, right? There's very distinct roles for either of these, even though both can do overlapping tasks. Now, I've had this for, I don't know, 6 months or something like that. I've used it quite a bit. I've been using a crosscut sled since, I don't know, the first month or two of having a table saw. So I'm going to run over kind of the differences I've experienced and basically why I still have both of them, because I think they're both kind of essential in their own way once you start getting higher and higher in the complexities of projects, and certain cuts just feel better. They're easier to do on one or the other. Let's get the very obvious out of the way. A normal 90-degree crosscut sled can only cut 90 degrees. It does one thing very well. And by 90 degrees, I mean cutting to width. You can absolutely still cut bevels with a crosscut sled, but unless you have a sled that's kind of an in-between, like the Rockler one that can pivot, you're going to be cutting only one angle at a time due to how you have to angle the fence on this. The miter gauge can obviously cut every single angle you want. This one's got 0 to 180. Don't know why you'd need some of those angles, but it can do it. So the very basic ultimate difference is that 90 degrees, very, very good at that. Every other angle, very, very good at that. Up next is one of the main differences that I noticed the most using both of these, but mainly when I started using this one a little more after getting it and using this one less. With the crosscut sled, if you're doing one that's spanning both sides of the blade, you get the double hand hold. It is, in my opinion, a more natural kind of secure feel as you're going through. I know some people put a clamp on it and they clamp it and push it. I really like the double hand hold if I have a piece that's spanning on enough on either side. But just in general, I just think it's a more kind of comfortable, secure feeling when you're pushing through. I think it's slightly, though not necessarily awkward, slightly more awkward to come at this from this angle right here. You've got one hand and you're essentially relying on a stop block of some sort as kind of your other position point for a lot of cuts. Now, some people don't roll with one of these, they just hold it down. I always like to have this here just to make sure nothing moves, but you don't anymore have that ability to do this and use both hands to hold things in place. I think that's just in daily use, one of the most fundamental differences is how you hold the workpiece on either of these. I have an entirely separate crosscut sled for cutting bevels, mostly 45 degrees. This can slide to the other side of my table saw and cut bevels, but I just found that I've got this dialed in so it just works really well, but I much rather prefer holding the piece with two hands and pushing through this way than swapping this to the other side of the blade and holding like this. I don't feel as kind of secure and stable going through, and not in like a dangerous way, just in, I want the cleanest cut possible, meaning almost no movement whatsoever as we go through that blade. I just prefer this kind of holding style. I cut all my 45-degree bevels with this. Now, depending upon your miter gauge, you may or may not have an issue with this. The crosscut sled, if you make it well and you don't have to twist it around a bunch when you're dialing it in, which we'll talk about in a bit, you're going to get a nice zero clearance back on this. It's going to have just a single saw blade through, and as long as you continue using saw blades with that same thickness, it's going to work perfectly fine. With the miter gauge, you have to add your own backer board to this, and it gets a little chewed up if you're doing different angles as the blade is entering at different spots. It takes a little time to add one on there. I actually just prefer the feel without a thicker piece in front there. I think it feels good in terms of thickness of hand. When I add a backer board on top of this, it's a little thick. I don't love it, so I mainly just use it like this. This is gonna come into play with tear out, right? With that last fiber being ripped out as the saw goes by. Now, unfortunately, over the years and using different size saw blades, this has been torn up a fair bit. So it no longer offers that perfect kind of zero clearance. But if you're just building one and it's fresh, it's going to have a near zero clearance cut, which is huge for certain types of cuts and certain pieces, anything you don't want tear out on. So off the bat, this does not offer that without adding some sort of backer board to truly get over the whole saw blade. Most people do not like to set this up right on the blade, and with a saw stop you just can't. It will trip it if you touch it at all. So even though you've got an edge here, it's not quite the same as a zero clearance of a totally fresh faceplate that's been cut through just once, or maybe one and a little bit for a minor adjustment. The next major one here is that we are losing blade height when we do a crosscut sled. Now maybe you make yours thinner, 1/2 inch. I prefer 3/4. I like the added weight, but you're immediately losing whatever the thickness of your material is in blade height. That may or may not matter. Most table saws go to, I don't know, like 3 1/8 or something like that. It's quite large. There's not a lot of stuff you're going to be cutting on a table saw that thick, so losing that amount may not matter. But if it does matter, you have to figure out whether losing that amount of blade height by raising it off the table is going to impact your projects or not. If you need every single last inch of blade height and you don't want to be like flipping the workpiece over, the miter gauge is going to allow you to keep it flat to the table. Now, one thing you'll notice is that relative to a lot of other people, YouTubers, I have a very small crosscut sled. I don't make a ton of large projects, and the times that I do need to cut something, I quite literally take this face off. So in terms of storage size, these are almost identical, to be honest, if not nearly identical. So for me, storage is not kind of a big deal in that I don't have a huge crosscut sled. However, if you build a really big crosscut sled, it's going to require more area to store it in. Now, there's plenty of clever ways of hanging them on the wall. I just lean mine up against the wall, kind of sitting on a block to keep it off the ground, and it's nearly flush against the wall minus a few inches. So storage space may or may not depend on the size you build it. This is actually a little awkward to store. I have to kind of hang it through something like this. I would actually say this is easier to store than the miter gauge is. However, when it comes to size, we can make the crosscut sled as big or as small as we want, which is a huge advantage. The miter gauge is going to be whatever size you buy it in. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller. They're all relatively similar in size. You can buy giant ones that go on the entire side of a table saw, but that's not really relevant to this point. So if you're working with quite thick pieces, long pieces, this is going to give you more of a backer plate to work with here. It's going to give you more support on either side of the blade, really. This can go out quite a ways to the left here, but it still offers nothing on the right side of the blade. So if I'm cutting, let's say, a 4-foot board, let's say, yeah, 4-foot board in half or something like that, right? I'm going to have no way of supporting this 2-foot piece coming off the side as I push through. All I've got is here, whereas if I'm on here, I've got a hand on each side as I go through. Now, I think mine is limited to, I don't know, 8 or 9 inches, something like that. Like I said, it's very tiny. A lot of people, the standard size is just much bigger than this. I just don't cut things that wide all that often, and I didn't need a bigger one. And like I said, I just pop this front thing off when I need to, and it's not the most stable, but for 1 or 2 cuts, it's not too bad. So the ability to customize is really important with the crosscut sled. With the miter gauge, it's whatever it comes with from the factory. Just, you're not changing that. With this one, you can adjust it to your hands. You can make this taller, shorter. You can add a nice round over, some bevels. You can determine the length of this. Everything can be customized with the crosscut sled, and that's just not possible with the miter gauge. You get what you get. So in that sense, I really like the crosscut sled to kind of make it to what I need it to be. I don't need a panel crosscut sled. This is mostly for small parts. I can make one that size and it works great for me. At the same time, because my blade tilts to the left, I needed more fence from my bevel crosscut sled off to the right, but I still wanted some support to the left. So because I'm able to make this, I can have this much further off to one side, position it where I want to when I make that initial cut, and I still have some support on this side, but I'm not putting my hand on this side because the blade is angling that way. I just have something that'll catch the offcuts and be pushed through instead of kind of sitting under the blade. This will pull them right through, which I think is just a little bit safer. Again, customization. I wanted this one pretty small in terms of height here because I'm mainly cutting flat pieces, whereas I've got some that are Standing up here, I want it a little thicker. Total customization with the Crosscut sleds, and I think that's pretty important. Now, the one upside of the miter gauge in terms of sizing is that this is adjustable. This fence comes in and out, so I can have a smaller storage area while also being able to extend the end of this. I don't know if it's 24 inches, it's something like that out to the side, maybe more, maybe a little less. Whatever I make here has got to stay that way. So if I need 36 inches for some reason, and I make one with 36 inches, and it's not sliding back together, it's always going to be 36 inches unless you lop it off for some reason. So we get some adjustability here and customization here. It's a bit of a trade-off. Smaller package, longer fence able, going to stay at that same size no matter what. Another thing I really like in terms of customization is that when you build your own, you can use whatever miter bar you want. You can use a piece of wood, make it that way. This is a Craig miter bar. Now, I will say the miter bar on this Incra is by far the best miter bar I've ever used, but I don't know if they just sell that individually. What I like about these is when I was starting out, I didn't want to spend a ton of money. I could just make the runner out of wood. I thought that was really nice, really convenient. Eventually, I wanted something a little more chunky, a little more robust that didn't wear down as much over time, and I went with the Craig one. So the ability to customize even just the parts you use is really convenient here in terms of how much you spend. Another big benefit of the Crosscut sled, especially kind of a smaller one, is cutting tiny little parts. It gets a little awkward if you need to use a stop block and specific distances to cut tiny, I'm talking tiny little parts on this guy. Remember, we are on one side of the blade only, and I'm trying to put my piece right there, and I'm trying to hold on to that. I don't love it. I don't love it at all. Even though this has a measuring tape that goes all the way to, 0 and 1 inch, I don't like it when you're getting under 2 1/4, 2 inches. It starts to get just a little weird, a little sketchy, awkward. On the Crosscut sled though, this one's super simple. It just feels way more natural to pinch a piece on either side like that. And if we get really tiny, you can even just take a pen or a pencil and pinch one side down with that. I don't want to say this is a safety risk or anything like that. I'm just saying that it feels less sketchy to cut very tiny little pieces on the Crosscut sled than on the miter gauge if you're using a stop block and you have that kind of in your way holding it there. In terms of just general safety, I don't think one of these is superior to the other really. I know a lot of people do get injured on Crosscut sleds because they end up leaving their thumbs kind of behind this thing and they get lopped right off. Assuming you don't have a saw stop, you're going to need to make sure you don't put your thumb behind there. Now, personally, what I did is I just glued a piece of wood that always tells me where my thumb is in the area, and I know as soon as I hit that thing, I'm getting a little too close. With this guy, though, we actually have both of our hands kind of out of the way and out to the side. So some people may argue you're a little more safe because you're just naturally off to the side and you're never going to be kind of right over it. Well, that's fine up until you're cutting small parts or you, for whatever reason, need to hold it really close to the saw. And then your hand is right back into a spot where it would otherwise be here. So I don't think one of these is inherently safer than the other due to design. I think you may have to go take an extra step to make sure you are safe when using this by either, some people paint kind of a yellow-red area on there, and the idea is don't put your hands in the red. Like I said, I just glued the back on this. There are a lot of ways to make this safe. So don't think of one of these as just inherently safer than the other. They can both lead to accidents or never an accident, depending upon you and how you use it. Let's get to one of the core issues that I've always had with Crosscut sleds, and that some of you will have had and some of you will laugh at and say, is this a joke? It is that you have to do all of the dialing in on these, and it takes a while. This is a minefield of tweaking this fence a little bit there, a little bit back, and putting a screw in, thinking I had it right, then it's not right, 5-cut method, all of that. It's right now, but as you can see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different positions with a second screw that did not hold it. So, and count 8, because then the one that actually worked would have been 8. So I have spent on I think my very first Crosscut sled, I may have spent over 2 hours trying to dial it in. I bet this one took 45 minutes to an hour. It can be an incredibly lengthy process, and to some people it just comes simple, and it happens right away and they only put a single screw in and it's just correct. And I know Jonathan Katz-Moses, I believe, now sells something that helps you set them up. But for me, when I built my first one, I felt like I was being driven insane trying to dial in. And you do at some point have to decide how close is close enough. With the miter gauge, it was not perfect 90 out of the box. I knew my table saw was set up correctly, so when it wasn't, therefore I knew it wasn't perfect out of the box. However, the adjustability mechanisms in these are really simple and really obvious. It's just a couple of screws on here. You undo it, you move it one way a little bit, you tighten it, you check it. It took maybe 4 minutes, 2 minutes. It was nothing. With this one, you got to clamp it down, drill a hole, put the screw in. Is it right? Maybe, maybe not, over and over. And again, like I said, some of you will laugh at that because you figured it out really quick. I just didn't. So for me, this was a big hassle. And well, especially my first one mainly. I kind of figured out the method when I got to this one. It just still took a while, but not as long. This guy, 2 minutes. And that kind of mattered to me. When this came out of the box, not 90 degrees, I was sitting there thinking, do I have to deal with everything I did with that? With this, no. It's a couple screws, tilt the fence a little bit, good to go. Up next, we have the ability to put a stop block on either side of the blade without having to transition the miter gauge to another side. Maybe this one's just for me, but there are certain things that I cut where I want a stop, and I really like it to be on the right side of the blade. I was cutting these out earlier today, and I was using my flat top grind blade to remove this here. For whatever reason, I just like holding the piece on the left and having my stop on the right. I don't know, I didn't like doing it the other way. It didn't feel as comfortable, so I put the stop block on the right. This one, it's only on the left, unless I transition this to the right and go to the other side of the table saw. I didn't really want to do that. For me, it's only on the left. That's just how I see it. So the ability to put a stop block left and right, just kind of really easily, not having to change anything, actually kind of important to me in terms of what I do quite often. I just like that ability. But at the same time, with a basic kind of clamp it stop, you have to do your own micro adjusting. Let's put it that way. This guy has this cool little knob and it just scoots it over a little bit and it's fancy and all of that. With your kind of generic stop block and a clamp, you kind of just have to sit in there and tap it a little bit and give it a little cut. Is it close enough? Did you go too far? I don't know. You're just kind of tapping it a little more. And of course, you can spend money and get a T-track and a fancy stop, and you can do all of that stuff. Though you start to get into a price range that becomes comparable to an actual miter gauge, though obviously you're still getting a crosscut sled. But with these stops, I love being able to put it on either side, but the ability to adjust is simply significantly better on this miter gauge and any miter gauge that has a micro adjust. Speaking of the cost, this is going to be a big one. For the most basic crosscut sled, I'm talking just using a piece of wood for the runner. I prefer MDF, some people use plywood, but just a 2x4 sheet of MDF, you're looking at, I don't know, $25, $30 maybe, given the price of MDF in your area. And this was like $180, and I got it at one of the lower prices I've seen in a while. That's a big difference, okay? Even with this miter bar, I think this miter bar for a 2-pack was like $20. So add another $10 on there for only using one of it with the other one on the other sled. We're up to maybe $40 here. If you wanted to add some aluminum T-track in a stop, maybe you're up to, I don't know, let's say $90 at that point. You can kind of keep adding more to the cost of this or not and just strip it all the way down. Wood runner and just a basic MDF. Obviously, you got to have some screws and a drill and all that, but that's not a cost I'm going to count towards this. Much cheaper if you want to go bare bones. Much more expensive, but has all the kind of fancy bells and whistles already in it. Now, I do like that you can incrementally add to the miter gauge, right, with a nice stop and T-track, and maybe you want to put a T-track clamp on there. All of that can be done, though at that point, you eventually do start getting into the cost realm of a miter gauge, and there are some kind of miter gauge crosscut, kind of mixes. It's like a miter gauge and a crosscut win at it, and Incra does sell something like that, but it's, is that expensive? So not really comparable in terms of cost. If you want to save cost, and you're really just looking to do the basics, this one's a no-brainer, 30, 35 bucks, if that. Our final topic here is going to be accuracy, and a lot of this is going to come down to you. Both of these, like I said, need to kind of be set up. Maybe you get lucky and it's 90 out of the box and you never have to touch it, but they make it adjustable for a reason. So in a sense, both of these will rely on you, the user, to make sure they are accurate. It doesn't necessarily do it for you. So if you were like me and you were struggling to dial this in, it's not going to guarantee that it's going to come out of the box at 90 degrees, though the adjustment is much simpler. That doesn't mean that this one is more accurate than this one. Both of these can be identical accurate levels, and I would say these are probably pretty close for me. They're pretty dialed in. So don't think you're going to get away with somehow getting better accuracy out of this one just because it's a machined product that somebody made. You can absolutely get borderline within the thousandths of an inch accuracy out of a crosscut sled. There are a bunch of videos on how. It takes a little time and a little math, but otherwise you're not gaining accuracy on a 90-degree cut by going with the miter gauge over the crosscut sled. On this miter gauge, you do get, I would say, a better miter bar. Little to no real play at all, which is going to come into play with your accuracy. But if you make or buy a miter bar, that's not going to be a problem for you on the crosscut sled. And then obviously the only other thing in terms of accuracy is our angles, but there's no real reason to compare here because this simply can't do that. These can do bevels in 90 degrees unless you build one only for a specific angle, which people do for picture frames. People will build a crosscut sled, we'll just call it that, to do 45 degrees. But much like my bevel one, you then have to have a whole separate sled. Whereas this, I can do 45, I can go straight back to 90 in 10, 20 seconds. It's just a trade-off between the two. That was basically all I could think of in terms of my actual use, my experience with both of these, and trying to give you a head start and maybe answer a question as to, do you want to spend a bunch of money on a miter gauge, though you can spend less and go cheaper? Or do you want to just stick with a crosscut sled? Or if you have one, do you want to buy a miter gauge? And as you can see, I have both. I have no intention of getting rid of this or my other bevel crosscut sled. These will all be here. And I'm sure within a couple years, I will build a new one of these because this is a little chewed up. They will always both be in my shop. I also, though, do not own a miter saw. I got rid of my miter saw a long time ago, mainly because I just never used it for angles, though I find myself using angles more now than I did before, ironically. So hopefully that helped. If you have anything to add, something that made up the mind for you, or something where you bought one and then you bought another because of a specific reason, please add it down in the comments, and have a good day. Bye.